Celeste Morgan walked into the courtroom in handcuffs, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. No one knew she was actually the FBI director working undercover to investigate the very people laughing at her. She wasn't there to clear her name. She was there to let the system expose its own prejudice, arrogance, and racism. But can silence alone turn a courtroom built on bias completely upside down? What do you think she'll do next? Drop a comment. Share this video if you believe justice doesn't have to shout to be heard. Now let's dive into Celeste's gripping story. It was just after 9 when the doors to courtroom 3C swung open, and every eye turned toward the woman in orange. Celeste Morgan, 50 years old, black and barely 5'6", was flanked by 2 uniformed officers as she stepped forward in silence, her wrists still bound in cuffs that glinted under the fluorescent lights. She didn't look at anyone. Not at the rows of faces that shifted in their seats to get a better look. Not at the murmuring jury box. Not even at the judge sitting high above her. Her gaze was fixed, straight ahead, calm and unreadable, as if she'd been here before, not in this courtroom maybe, but somewhere very much like it. From the back bench, the laughter came first. Low snickering, careless. Officer Blake, all biceps and smirks, leaned sideways toward his fellow officers, Sergeant Conroy and Lieutenant Daniels, and said it just loud enough to carry across the room. "Here comes Lady Mute." They all chuckled as if it were an inside joke the entire courtroom was in on. Conroy gave a slow, mocking shake of the head. "Bet she doesn't say a word the whole damn time." Judge Ralph Marlowe adjusted his robe as if the theatrics bored him already. He glanced at the file in front of him, then back at Celeste without lifting his chin. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Celine. Morgan's, is it?" Celeste didn't flinch, didn't correct him. She simply stood there, still in cuffs, still quiet. The bailiff stepped forward. "Your Honor, the defendant is choosing to waive her right to appointed counsel." The judge's eyebrow twitched, more annoyed than surprised. "Is that so?" He looked at her directly now, as if daring her to speak up. And she did, finally, her voice even and low. "I'll represent myself." The room reacted almost instantly. There were chuckles, head shakes, even 1 or 2 audible scoffs from the gallery. Weller, the prosecutor, looked up from her notes with a smirk that said everything another misguided soul thinking they could out-talk the system. But Celeste stood still, letting the moment pass without another word. Back near the exit, Tomas Lynn didn't laugh. His camera wasn't out. He wasn't taking photos. He was watching, observing. He'd covered courtroom drama for the better part of a decade, but something about this one made him stop writing mid-sentence. It wasn't just the way the officers reacted to her. It wasn't the misplaced confidence in their tone or the judge's obvious disinterest. It was her, Celeste. The way she stood, not like someone who was terrified, not even like someone who'd surrendered, but like someone waiting. Patiently. As if she wasn't the one on trial at all. The judge, still unimpressed, waved a hand as if brushing a fly off the bench. "Very well, but I won't tolerate disruptions. If this is some performance, it won't end well for you, Ms. Morgan." Celeste said nothing. She didn't move. The bailiff guided her to the defense table, uncuffed her wrists without ceremony, and stepped away. Celeste sat slowly, never once shifting her eyes toward the judge, the gallery, or the prosecution's table. Not even the defense table looked like it mattered to her. She rested her palms flat on its surface like she wasn't there to argue but to observe. Like this whole place was one giant experiment and the results were already coming in. Blake leaned back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, clearly enjoying himself. "Bet she thinks she's gonna teach us all a lesson." Thomas heard it. So did several others, but no one said a thing. Judge Marlowe, meanwhile, was already looking impatient. "Let's proceed," he said. The court reporter nodded, fingers poised. The courtroom settled into a rhythm, but that rhythm was strained off-beat like a string slightly out of tune. Celeste Morgan hadn't said anything except one line yet. The atmosphere around her had shifted. It was in the way the prosecutor glanced at her now, less amused, more calculating. It was in the way the laughter faded just a little quicker than before. And it was in the way Tomas leaned forward in his seat, not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. He'd covered loud cases, shouting matches, protests, outbursts. But this wasn't that. This was something quieter, slower, colder, and that he thought made it more dangerous. He began typing a note into his phone, not for the story, but for himself. Celeste Morgan, watch closely. Something's not adding up. And just like that, the first words of her story were finally being written. Not in her voice, not in the judge's ruling, but in the quiet between sentences where something deeper had begun to stir. The prosecutor stood with that quiet, practiced confidence that came from years of knowing the court would always lean slightly in her favor. Rachel Weller didn't raise her voice, and she didn't need to. Her posture said enough. This wasn't a case she planned to lose. Your Honor, she began, eyes flicking briefly toward the jury. The state will demonstrate that Ms. Celeste Morgan actively resisted lawful commands at a public transit terminal, disrupted city operations, and created an environment in which officers were forced to intervene. She paused, not for emphasis, but because she knew no one would question her. At the defense table, Celeste sat unmoving. Her hands rested neatly together, her gaze fixed on nothing and everything at once. She didn't look at the prosecutor. She didn't glance at the jury. She simply listened, still and quiet. Weller pressed a button on her remote, and the overhead screen lit up with body cam footage from Officer Blake. The video showed the sidewalk outside a bus terminal. Morning light, early commuters, a slow bustle of city movement. The camera jostled a bit as Blake approached a woman standing alone, Celeste. He said something to her. His posture shifted. He stepped closer. But the sound was gone. The entire clip played on silent. Blake's mouth moved. His hands gestured. Celeste turned her head slightly calm, not reacting. Then, after several seconds, the audio abruptly returned. Put your hands behind your back. Blake's voice snapped through the speakers. Weller looked at the judge. As the video shows, the defendant's refusal to comply made arrest unavoidable. Celeste finally looked up. Her voice was quiet even. May I ask a question about that video? The prosecutor turned more amused than annoyed. Go ahead. Celeste leaned forward just slightly. Not confrontational, not challenging, just curious. Why is the audio gone right at the moment when the officer raises his voice? Weller blinked. Could be a glitch. That happens sometimes. Celeste paused just for a moment. Not too long. Just enough to make the silence feel deliberate. Then may I request the original file, including the internal metadata and the continuous audio log. Now Weller hesitated. She opened her folder, glanced down as if she might find an answer there, then closed it again. That won't be necessary for this hearing. Celeste didn't push. She didn't need to. She looked at the judge, not pleading, not demanding, simply present. Some things only seem unimportant when you're not the one being accused. The room shifted. No one spoke, but something had turned. The air felt different. From the back bench, Officer Blake leaned toward his colleagues and muttered a little too loudly. She probably just read some law books in jail, doesn't make her smart. There were soft chuckles, familiar ones, the kind that came easy when power was so comfortably seated in the room. But Tomas Lynn didn't laugh. He sat straighter, watching Celeste more closely now. There was something about the way she spoke, not defiant, not desperate, calculated, controlled. He jotted a line in his notebook, too calm, too sharp. Not your average defendant. And that was the part he couldn't shake. Celeste hadn't objected, hadn't raised her voice, but she'd taken their strongest piece of evidence and bent it slightly. Not enough to break it, just enough to make everyone else notice the crack. She hadn't accused anyone of tampering. She didn't need to. She simply pointed at the silence and waited to see who got nervous first. Judge Marlowe cleared his throat. If there are disputes about evidence, they'll be addressed during review. For now, let's continue. Celeste offered no reply. She returned her hands to the table, her posture unchanged. Weller didn't smirk this time. She glanced once at the jury, then back to her notes. There was a different weight to her voice when she continued. Tomas leaned back slightly. His eyes moved from Celeste to Blake to the jury to the judge. The room felt unsettled. He tapped his pen slowly and scribbled one more line. She's not here to win. She's here to watch. The strange part was she hadn't done much. Just a few quiet words, a question, a look. But in that courtroom full of uniforms and titles and people used to being right, she made them hesitate. And sometimes Thomas knew hesitation was more dangerous than a shout. Because if a woman like that was asking questions, you had to wonder what answers were coming next. The prosecutor had just finished her third round of questions. and the courtroom was starting to feel like it had settled into rhythm. But then, Celeste moved just slightly. She shifted forward in her chair, placed both hands flat on the defense table, and looked directly at the prosecutor for the first time since the trial began. "With all due respect," she said calmly, under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, "it is a federal offense for anyone acting under color of law to deprive another person of their constitutional rights." That line stopped everything. Weller lowered her papers. The gallery fell silent. Even Judge Marlowe looked up from his notes, squinting slightly as if he hadn't heard her right. "I'm sorry, what was that?" he asked, his tone suddenly less dismissive. Celeste turned to him, her voice still low, steady. "Title 18, Section 242, Federal Law. It prohibits any official police, judges, prosecutors from using their position to violate a citizen's civil rights, especially through unlawful arrest, use of force, or suppression of evidence." Weller stepped back. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate. The defendant is attempting to turn this into a classroom." The judge narrowed his eyes at Celeste. "This isn't a lecture hall, Miss Morgan." Celeste didn't flinch. "No," she replied, "but it should at least be a courtroom." The sentence landed like a slap. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. For a moment, no one moved. Then Weller tried to recover. "You may be familiar with the language of the law, Miss Morgan, but that doesn't change the facts. You resisted arrest. You ignored instructions. You created a public disturbance." Celeste looked at her, then slowly turned her eyes toward the screen where the body cam footage had been shown earlier. "You submitted edited video as primary evidence," she said. There was no audio during the officer's most aggressive moment. There was no timestamp verification. There was no chain of custody log. If I were a prosecutor and submitted that, I'd be held in contempt. Judge Marlowe sat back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "You are not a prosecutor, Miss Morgan." She met his eyes without hesitation. "No, I'm a black woman standing alone in your courtroom with 3 white officers behind me and an edited piece of evidence trying to define me. That makes me far more careful than a prosecutor." A few audible exhales escaped the gallery. Blake shifted in his seat behind her, muttering something to Conroy, but this time he didn't sound quite so smug. From the back, Tomas Lynn watched the whole thing unfold like it wasn't real. He'd seen defendants protest, cry, shout, plead, but not this. Not someone dismantling a courtroom with nothing but precision and patience. He opened his phone again, typed Celeste Morgan into the search bar. Still nothing. No arrest records, no employment history, no database tags. It didn't make sense. He messaged a friend in the DOJ press office. "Need a fast favor. Got a woman in court quoting federal statutes like a seasoned prosecutor. Name's Celeste Morgan. Can't find a trace of her. Too clean, too calm, ring a bell." Back at the front, Weller tried again. "You're not here to critique the legal system. You're here to answer for your actions." Celeste didn't blink. "My actions?" she asked. "Or your assumptions about my silence? Your team labeled me uncooperative before I opened my mouth." She paused just long enough. "If you mistake silence for guilt, then this room was never meant for justice. It was meant for obedience." The judge leaned forward, voice lower now. "You're walking a fine line, Miss Morgan." Celeste nodded. "I know exactly where the line is. That's why I haven't crossed it." Tomas felt it. The room wasn't just reacting anymore, it was recalibrating. The jury was no longer looking at her like a defendant. They were watching her like someone they didn't quite understand yet, but knew they should. Weller's tone had lost its certainty. And Marlowe, for the first time, wasn't interrupting. Tomas checked his phone. A new message lit up the screen. "Nothing under that name. But you might want to ask someone in Federal Internal Affairs. If she's clean across all systems, she's either nobody or somebody very protected." He stared at that last line. Somebody very protected. He looked back up at Celeste, now sitting still again, not speaking, just watching. Not nervous, not defensive, not trying to win anyone over. She was watching them. And that's when Tomas understood. She wasn't defending herself at all. She was testing them. Every single one of them. The judge, the prosecutor, the system, the room. And they didn't even realize it yet. Before Celeste ever learned the law, she learned to hold her tongue. It happened on a hot spring afternoon when she was just 17. She was waiting at the downtown bus terminal, clutching her books and a bus pass when 2 patrol officers pulled up. One of them, tall, white, impatient, stepped out and stared at her like she didn't belong there. She hadn't spoken a word yet. "You deaf or just ignoring me?" he barked. Celeste blinked, startled. She didn't know what he was talking about. She hadn't heard him call out before. She said nothing, not because she meant to be defiant, but because the question didn't make sense. That silence cost her. He slapped her across the face with the back of his hand. Not hard enough to bleed, but hard enough to drop her books. The other officer stepped forward. "She's not cooperating," he muttered, already reaching for cuffs. Before either of them could take another step, a woman burst from the station doors. Her mother. Small frame, big eyes, voice shaking but polite. "What did my daughter do?" she asked, her hand rising palm out, not to fight, just to shield. That was enough. They turned on her instead, slammed her to the pavement, cuffed her, booked her for obstruction. That night, Celeste sat alone in a holding cell and stared at the concrete wall until dawn. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just repeated that question over and over in her head. What did she do wrong? The answer came unspoken and brutal. She spoke. That was when silence became her shield. It wasn't about fear. It was survival. Quiet couldn't be misquoted. Quiet didn't escalate. And sometimes quiet gave the enemy enough rope to hang themselves. Back in the present-day courtroom, Celeste sat in silence once again. Her hands rested calmly on the table in front of her, but her eyes scanned the room slowly, methodically, as if she were taking mental notes that no one else could see. Then her gaze locked on someone. A man in uniform sitting just off to the side near the back, clearly trying not to draw attention. His posture was too stiff. His eyes kept darting away from her. She remembered him, not from the night she was arrested. From years earlier. A training exercise, a misfiled complaint, a hallway confrontation that never made it into any official record. She remembered his face because of how he'd laughed at a victim who couldn't speak. And now here he was, watching her, trying not to be noticed. He failed. Celeste didn't say a word, didn't even blink. But he knew she saw him. That much was clear. And it unsettled him. In the gallery, Thomas Lynn sat with his pen frozen above his notebook. His phone had just buzzed again. He unlocked it and read the latest message from his friend at the Department of Justice. She's not in any public database. She was part of DOJ intelligence, internal task force. Last year, she got pulled off the grid, something about classified reassignment. That's all I can say. Thomas exhaled slowly. So she wasn't just smart. She was connected. Deeply. Silently. That explained the way she moved through the courtroom, never loud, never desperate. She wasn't trying to win. She was studying them. He looked back at her and suddenly felt something new. Not pity, not curiosity. Respect. Celeste had been letting them underestimate her. Letting them think she was just another woman with a public defender too proud to speak, too uneducated to fight back. But now he saw it. She had been setting the trap. The courtroom returned to motion as the judge called a recess. People began standing, chatting, filing out for coffee and fresh air. But Celeste didn't move. She stayed seated, back straight, hands still, like a woman who'd been waiting years for this moment and wouldn't dare waste a second of it. And that man in the back, the one she had recognized, stood up too fast, avoided her eyes, walked out a little too quickly. Thomas noticed. So did Celeste. And for a fraction of a second, she allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction. Not because she'd won anything yet, but because the first crack had formed. The silence that once protected her was now beginning to expose them. And for the first time in the trial, someone else in that courtroom looked nervous. Not her. It started with a smirk. Officer Blake walked to the witness stand like a man arriving late to a party he thought was already won. His uniform was crisp, his jaw set, but his eyes betrayed a confidence too comfortable, too easy. He looked at the jury, then over at Celeste, and gave a small, theatrical sigh like he couldn't believe they were wasting time on this. He adjusted the mic. She was standing completely still, he said, like the words had been rehearsed 100 times. Didn't flinch. Didn't speak. That's not normal. It felt off. We didn't know what she might be hiding or planning. Celeste's eyes didn't shift. Her hands remained folded steady. "Officer," she said, voice calm, clear. Not raised, but it cut the air like a scalpel. Since when did stillness become violence? The courtroom stiffened. Blake blinked. "It's about behavior," When someone refuses to comply, Celeste tilted her head slightly. I asked about stillness. You said I stood still. You used that word. You also said you felt threatened. I'm asking how a lack of movement triggered a sense of danger in trained officers like yourself. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was heavy. Thomas, watching from the back, scribbled 2 words in his notebook: control shifts. Blake shifted in his seat, suddenly less sure of where the center of power in this room was. Before he could answer, Prosecutor Weller jumped in, standing quickly, like she needed to plug a leak before it turned into a flood. Your Honor, she said sharply, given the unusual nature of the defendant's behavior and her insistence on self-representation. I'd like to file a request for immediate psychological evaluation. Judge Marlowe didn't hesitate. Granted. Not a pause, not a glance toward Celeste. He just signed off on it like he was clicking through a pop-up window. That's when Celeste slowly stood up. Her movements weren't fast, but they were deliberate, and they changed the temperature in the room. I see, she said softly. A woman stands silent in a courtroom where she's laughed at, misnamed, and interrupted, and your response is to question her sanity. You're not threatened by disorder. You're threatened by dignity. The words dropped like stones. Blake opened his mouth to object, but Celeste was already stepping forward, stopping just within the boundary of the defendant's table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't break protocol. But something in the way she stood straight, unyielding, made even Judge Marlowe look up. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to enter a new piece of evidence into the record, one that the prosecution failed to present. Weller's eyes narrowed. That wasn't filed. Celeste held up a small USB drive, no flourish, no drama. This contains security footage from a nearby city surveillance node. Public street, government property. Captures the moment of arrest from a wider angle than the officer's body cam. Marlowe leaned forward. And where exactly did you obtain this? Celeste didn't blink. From a federal archive, with proper clearance. Weller shot up again. She's bluffing. Civilians don't have access to those archives. Celeste looked at her. Just looked. The way a chess master might look at someone who'd moved a pawn directly into a trap. I never said I was a civilian. That landed. The room didn't gasp, but it felt like it did. The kind of collective inhale where no one wanted to be the first to ask the obvious question. Marlowe leaned back in his chair slowly. His fingers tapped the armrest, a quiet staccato of discomfort. We'll review it, he said, his voice losing just a thread of its usual edge. Court is recessed until then. The bailiff took the USB. Blake stepped down quickly, no longer smirking. Tomas closed his notebook without writing another word. And Celeste, she sat back down like nothing had changed. But everything had, because suddenly the people who had controlled the narrative, Blake, Weller, even Judge Marlowe, were no longer steering it. And the woman they'd accused of being unstable, she had just forced the system to pause, without raising her voice, without threatening anyone, just by being exact, just by being prepared. Just by standing still and refusing to shrink. You could feel it building. Like the weight in the room had changed, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. The court had reconvened after a brief recess, but something had shifted in the air. Celeste sat perfectly still again, her face unreadable. The USB had been reviewed in chambers, but no ruling had been given yet. And then it happened. Tomas Lynn, who had been nothing more than a quiet reporter in the back of the courtroom, suddenly stood. There was no permission, no official cue. He simply stood, one hand clutching his phone, the other trembling slightly. Your Honor, he said, voice steady but urgent. I need to submit new information into the record. It's regarding the identity of the defendant. Judge Marlowe leaned forward sharply. Mr. Lynn, you are not counsel. You do not have the right to. Thomas stepped forward anyway, ignoring the murmurs behind him. He turned the screen of his phone toward the court staff first, then toward the prosecution. This is a direct email from the Department of Justice. It confirms Celeste Morgan is not just affiliated with the DOJ, she is the regional director of the FBI for the Atlanta Division. The words hung in the air like thunder. You could feel it ripple across the room. Some gasped, others whispered, but most just froze. Marlowe's face darkened. Bailiff, remove him from this courtroom immediately. But before the bailiff could move, the doors opened at the rear of the chamber and everything changed. A man in a dark suit stepped in, flanked by 2 others in plainclothes, badges already visible, movement precise. He walked straight down the aisle as if he'd been waiting for this very moment. His presence wasn't loud, but it was heavy. Judge Marlowe, the man said, holding up a sealed folder as he reached the front. Special Agent Monroe. Department of Justice. He handed the folder to the court clerk and looked directly at the bench. We are here under federal authority. This courtroom is now under observation by the Justice Department's Internal Oversight Division. The defendant's credentials and position have been verified. Her actions today are sanctioned and protected under federal investigative protocols. You could have heard a pin drop. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even the judge. Monroe continued calm and clear. Per federal order, this court's proceedings will be monitored from this point forward. Any attempt to interfere will be reported directly to Washington. Then he turned slightly toward Celeste and gave her the smallest nod. Not a gesture of deference, but of recognition, of respect. And that's when Celeste finally moved. Slowly, she lifted her head, not just to look around, but to meet the judge's eyes. For the first time in the trial, she allowed her gaze to lock directly with his. And Marlowe, who had spoken over her, dismissed her, laughed along with others at her silence, looked away. He blinked. He shifted in his chair. Because whatever else he might have believed about her, whatever power he thought he held in this room, it was gone now. Celeste didn't smile. She didn't gloat. That wasn't her style. But something had changed in her posture. It wasn't louder. It wasn't more aggressive. It was just unshakable. Tomas sat back down slowly, his hands still trembling. He hadn't planned to speak. He hadn't come here looking for a story like this. But when the truth landed in his lap, he couldn't keep it to himself. He glanced over at Blake and Conroy and Daniels, the officers who'd laughed earlier. They weren't laughing now. Their faces were pale stiff. They understood something now that they hadn't before. This wasn't just about a woman who refused a lawyer. This was about a system being watched. Celeste turned slightly toward the jury, who were frozen, unsure what to think anymore. And she said, just loud enough for them to hear, I asked for no lawyer because I didn't come here to defend myself. I came here to watch what justice looks like when it thinks no one's looking. And for the first time since she had walked into that courtroom in handcuffs, no one dared interrupt her. No one laughed. No one looked away. Because now they knew exactly who she was, and now they were the ones being judged. Celeste stood tall, still in that orange jumpsuit, still with no legal team beside her. And yet somehow it felt like she was the only one in the room not on trial. Her voice came quiet at first, but with a gravity that pulled every gaze toward her. I didn't fake being a defendant, she said, letting her eyes move from face to face. I simply let your prejudice cast me as one. You could feel the oxygen shift in the room. Judge Marlowe straightened in his chair, arms crossed. You mean to tell this court your arrest was orchestrated? Celeste didn't flinch. No, my arrest was predictable, that was the test. There were murmurs again. Sharp whispers cutting through the quiet, but no one moved. She looked over at the officers, Blake, Daniels, Conroy, who now sat frozen, their earlier grins long gone. You saw a black woman standing silently outside a courthouse, Celeste said, voice calm as steel. You demanded obedience. When I didn't move fast enough, you manufactured fear. Then you cuffed me for disorder. But the disorder, it was never mine. Officer Blake shoved back his chair and stood abruptly. You tricked us. You played the system. Celeste turned slowly toward him. She didn't raise her voice. I didn't play anything she said. You followed your script. I just turned up the volume. He started to speak again, but she cut in this time sharper. You called me threatening because I didn't flinch, because I didn't beg, because I didn't lower my eyes. Since when did stillness become violence? Silence. Blake's mouth opened, then closed. Celeste walked a few steps forward. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't posing. It was controlled, purposeful. For months, she continued my division at the FBI, collected data on racial disparities in state-level trials. What we found wasn't just disturbing, it was systemic. But statistics don't move hearts. They don't shame power. They don't change verdicts. She turned toward the jury box, then looked back to the judge. So we changed tactics. Marlowe's voice cracked sharp with disbelief. You're saying this entire case, this courtroom was staged? Celeste gave a small nod. No, Your Honor. This courtroom was real. That's the point. The biases, the dismissals, the mockery. None of that had to be staged. You gave it freely. Gasps rippled down the gallery. One juror dropped her pen. Thomas, still seated in the back, had gone pale. He scribbled in his notebook with fast, uneven strokes. She walked into a firestorm, just to prove it existed. Weller, the prosecutor, had heard enough. She stood without speaking, grabbed her files, and began to leave. Miss Weller Celeste called out gently, "You never looked at me. Not once during testimony. But you still called me uncooperative, unstable, unreliable." Weller stopped mid-step, but she didn't turn back. She simply walked out, shoulders rigid, head down. Celeste then faced the bench one last time. "You said this wasn't a lecture hall, Judge Marlowe," she said. "But maybe it should have been. Because what happened in this courtroom today was never justice. It was theater." Marlowe looked furious, but his hands stayed still. "I could have walked in with credentials," Celeste continued. "I could have come in with agents flanking me badges and titles. But none of that would have shown us the truth." She took a breath. "Only your unfiltered instinct could." Just then, Agent Monroe stepped forward again, handing a new file to the judge. "Your Honor, we are placing this district under a formal federal investigation. Every ruling made during this trial will be reviewed by independent oversight." Marlowe blinked. "I demand," but Monroe cut him off without raising his voice. "You don't get to demand anything now, Judge." Then Celeste stepped forward, looked him straight in the eye, and with perfect stillness said, "You've spent years judging others. Today you were the one weighed." And he couldn't even hold her gaze, because he knew, they all knew, this trial had never been hers. It had always been theirs. The room had gone still, like the air itself had stopped moving. All eyes were on Agent Monroe as he took another step forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority that no one in that courtroom could ignore. "We are releasing surveillance audio logs," he said, pulling out a stack of labeled flash drives and placing them on the clerk's desk, each one containing internal communications from the precinct involved in this case. Judge Marlowe leaned forward, the color slowly draining from his face. He opened his mouth, but Monroe didn't wait. These recordings were accessed through federal authorization. They contain racial slurs, coercive tactics, and coordinated efforts to manipulate both the arrest and court proceedings of Ms. Morgan. You could hear someone in the back of the courtroom gasp. Officer Blake's face twitched as if he wanted to run but couldn't move. Conroy's hand gripped the edge of his seat. Celeste sat still, eyes fixed ahead, unmoved. She hadn't said a word since Monroe entered, and somehow that silence had grown louder with every passing second. Monroe turned to the two officers. "You are both under federal arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242. The federal marshals stepped forward. There was no shouting, no resistance. Blake stood up, eyes darting to Celeste like he still didn't understand what was happening. Conroy, slightly slower, muttered something under his breath, but it was swallowed by the tension in the room. Daniels, the lieutenant who had laughed along with them earlier, stood before the marshals could reach him. With a trembling hand, he reached up to his chest and unclipped his badge. It clinked softly on the table as he set it down and stepped back, eyes cast downward. Monroe looked at him, then nodded once. "Voluntary resignation will be noted in your file, but it doesn't excuse what you allowed." Celeste's gaze finally shifted. She looked at Daniels not with anger, but with something closer to quiet recognition. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, just clarity. Judge Marlowe slammed his gavel once, but his voice cracked. "This court has not been—" Monroe raised a hand. "Judge Marlowe, under federal directive, your courtroom is now under immediate review by the Department of Justice. You are hereby suspended pending formal investigation." The silence that followed was nearly sacred. No one moved. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Even the air felt different, heavier, fuller. Marlowe blinked like he was struggling to wake from a nightmare he didn't know he had created. "You can't suspend a sitting judge." "We just did," Monroe said, quietly, and that was the end of it. Celeste stood not slowly, not dramatically, but with the kind of grace that comes from never needing to prove yourself. She didn't look around the room. She didn't nod or thank anyone. She simply walked to the door, every step silent but final. Thomas Lynn watched her go, still holding the pen he'd been gripping since the start of the hearing. He didn't write anything. He just whispered almost to himself. She didn't fight the system. She let it fight itself. And that somehow was more powerful than anything she could have said. 1 week after the courtroom chaos, Celeste Morgan finally stepped back into the public eye. Not in handcuffs, not in a courtroom, But standing tall behind a wooden podium at a quiet federal conference room in Atlanta, where a dozen reporters, federal officials, and even a few who had witnessed the trial sat waiting not to question her judgment, but to hear her speak. She wore a plain black suit, no flashy badge, no visible title, just her presence and the silence she carried with her like armor. When she spoke, the room stilled. "Silence isn't surrender," she said, her voice steady. "It's surveillance. It's the patience to watch a system you've given your life to, and to see who it truly serves when no one's watching." There was no anger in her tone, no righteousness, just the quiet force of someone who had earned every word through experience. I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, she continued, but because I knew no one was ready to listen. And now, when those who mocked me have been silenced, suddenly everyone's listening. Near the front row, a young reporter stood up, cautious but direct. "Director Morgan," he asked, "after everything that's happened, aren't you afraid of retaliation?" Celeste didn't blink. She just looked him straight in the eye. "I'd be more afraid," she replied, "if I'd stayed quiet." No one moved. Even the cameras didn't click for several seconds, as if the entire room agreed that moment needed to breathe. Sitting in the back corner was Thomas Lynn, the journalist who had scribbled every moment of her trial into his notebook. But today, he wasn't writing. He just sat there watching, knowing instinctively that what he was seeing was bigger than anything he could fit into a single article. The next morning, his piece went live. The headline was simple: "The defendant they mocked changed the courtroom forever." Tomas didn't write about a hero. He didn't need to. He wrote about a woman who let silence become her weapon, who stood still while the world revealed its bias, and who proved that sometimes the loudest power is the one that doesn't shout. That same day, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the reopening of 27 closed cases involving racially biased rulings in state courts. A federal task force was formed to re-examine local judicial procedures and recommend systemic reforms. And a memo was issued: every judge and officer involved in courtroom procedures would now undergo mandatory civil rights and constitutional training. And Celeste, she didn't issue another statement. She didn't appear on news shows or write a memoir. She simply returned to her work quietly because she had never needed a spotlight to do her job. But one thing was certain: from that day forward, no one in that courthouse, no judge, no cop, no spectator would ever laugh again when a quiet black woman walked into a courtroom alone, because now they knew. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is evidence. Sometimes silence is strategy. And in the hands of someone like Celeste Morgan, silence is justice. A week had passed since the courtroom shifted on its axis. The story had already made national headlines. Commentators debated it. Officials avoided it. And yet Celeste Morgan hadn't said a single word in public until that quiet Thursday morning. She walked into West Pine Middle School with her usual unshakable grace, dressed in a simple navy suit. No badges, no entourage. Just her. The auditorium wasn't packed, just a few classes, a row of teachers, and a media crew standing respectfully at the back. She wasn't there for the cameras. She took the mic, waited for the rustling to fade, and began without any notes. "People think silence is weakness," she said, her voice soft but steady. "They think if you don't shout, you must not have anything to say. But silence isn't surrender, it's surveillance. And when you watch long enough, you learn exactly what needs to change." The room fell still. There was no fidgeting, no whispers, just rows of young faces staring at a woman who had once sat handcuffed before a judge. "I stayed quiet," she continued, "because I knew no one was listening. But now, maybe you are." A small hand went up in the second row. The teacher beside her looked uncertain, but nodded gently. A black girl, couldn't have been more than 12, stood slowly, her voice almost trembling. "My brother's in jail," she said. "He was quiet too. He didn't fight back. Was he wrong?" The question hung in the air like a loaded scale. Celeste paused. She blinked once, and for the first time that morning her voice faltered just slightly. She stepped down from the stage and walked toward the girl heels clicking softly on the wood. She knelt not to diminish herself, but to meet the girl's eyes. "No," she said. "He wasn't wrong. Silence isn't wrong. But we have to make them hear it. That's the hard part. Not staying quiet, but teaching them to listen." The girl's eyes welled up. Celeste reached for her hand. She didn't expect the girl to hug her. But the moment the child's arms wrapped around her neck, something cracked. Something deep, old, maybe even sacred. Celeste held her tighter than she thought she would, tighter than she had held anyone in years. She wasn't sure who she was holding on to more, the girl or the girl she once was. The teachers looked on quietly. One wiped a tear without calling attention to herself. A security guard at the back folded his arms but didn't blink. Celeste gently let go, nodded once, and walked slowly back to the stage. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't need it. When she left the auditorium, it was just as she'd arrived, silent. But this time, the silence followed her like a vow. Outside, Tomas Lin waited beside a parked car camera hanging over his shoulder, eyes shaded with something between awe and disbelief. He didn't call out to her. He didn't ask for a quote. He just watched. Later that night, he sat in his apartment staring at a blank document. He'd written thousands of stories, covered protests, policies, politicians, but this was different. His fingers hovered before he finally typed. Power didn't walk out in a suit. It walked out in silence. And then he stopped, closed his laptop, because sometimes the last word doesn't belong to the writer. It belongs to the silence that stays long after the story ends. Sometimes the loudest voices don't come from those who shout, but from those who choose to wait to watch and to speak only when it matters most. Celeste Morgan reminded us that silence isn't weakness, it's patience, it's strategy. And when used right, it can shake the very ground we stand on. If this story moved you, made you think, or gave you chills, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who still believes that justice must be loud to be heard. And if you'd like more powerful stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. Your support means the world to us, and it gives our creative team the strength to keep telling the stories that matter. The stories that linger long after the screen fades to black. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We awaken memory.